The night was calm and the streets were quiet. An elderly black man drove home after attending a long day of discussions at a legal conference in the city. He wore a simple dark suit, neatly pressed, and his glasses sat comfortably on his face as he guided his luxury sedan through the nearly empty roads. To anyone who might have seen him, he appeared dignified and peaceful, just another man making his way home after a busy day. His car moved at the right speed, his signals were proper, and everything about his driving was careful, as though he respected every rule of the road. Not far behind him, a young police officer sat in his cruiser watching the sedan. Something about the sight bothered him. In his mind, he thought the elderly man didn't match the kind of driver who would own or afford such a car. The officer narrowed his eyes, his hands resting on the steering wheel, and suspicion filled his thoughts. Instead of appreciating the calm night, he focused on the idea that something was wrong. He decided to follow the sedan for a while, his headlights trailing behind. The elderly man noticed the police car in his rearview mirror, but he did not change his behavior. He kept driving smoothly, his hands steady and his mind on reaching home. He had spent years of his life learning how to remain composed in every kind of situation. Tonight would be no different. After a short while, the police car's lights flashed. Red and blue colors reflected on the sedan's mirrors, and the officer gave a short siren burst. The elderly man sighed softly, pulled his car safely to the side of the road, and waited. He turned off the engine, rolled down the window, and kept both hands on the wheel, a habit he had formed long ago, knowing it showed he had nothing to hide. The officer stepped out of his cruiser with an air of authority. His boots hit the pavement hard, his flashlight shining even though the street was already lit. He approached the car slowly, but not with respect. His voice carried a sharp edge when he spoke. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone flat and cold. The elderly man looked at him calmly and replied with a polite nod. "Of course, officer," he said in a gentle voice. He reached slowly into his jacket for his wallet, making sure his movements were clear and deliberate, then handed over his license. He also retrieved the car's registration papers from the glove box, placing them carefully in the officer's hand. Instead of thanking him, the officer frowned. He looked at the license, then at the man, then back at the expensive car. His suspicion grew stronger. "Whose car is this?" the officer asked sharply. "Where did you get it?" His words carried an assumption that the elderly man could not rightfully own such a vehicle. The man kept his tone even, almost calm enough to soften the sharp night air. "It is my car, officer. The documents you are holding confirm that." His words were steady, but inside he felt a quiet sadness. After all his years of service, his accomplishments, and his dedication, he was still being judged not by his actions but by appearances. The officer was not satisfied. He leaned closer, his flashlight beam shining into the car as though he were searching for something hidden. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice louder now. The man obeyed without protest. Slowly, with measured movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed open the door, and stepped onto the pavement. He stood tall, his shoulders straight despite his age. His presence was calm, almost dignified, even as the officer tried to treat him as suspicious. "Where are you coming from?" the officer pressed. His words were not curious but accusing. "What business do you have driving through this part of town at this hour?" He spoke as if the man owed him explanations beyond what was reasonable. The elderly man answered with patience. "I am returning from a conference. I am on my way home." His voice did not rise, nor did it break. It was steady, a tone that carried the weight of experience and wisdom. But the officer smirked slightly as if he did not believe him. "Conference, huh?" he muttered. "What kind of conference sends an old man out here in the middle of the night?" His flashlight beam drifted over the man's suit, his shoes, even his face, as though he were searching for flaws. The elderly man simply stood in silence for a moment, his calm eyes fixed on the officer. Finally, he said, "Officer, I assure you I have done nothing wrong. My papers are in order. If you run my license, you will find no issue." Instead of listening, the officer shook his head. His suspicion had grown into arrogance, and he convinced himself that he was right to doubt. He radioed for backup, speaking quickly into his shoulder mic. The elderly man heard the words, but did not react with anger. He folded his hands gently in front of him and waited. A few passing cars slowed as drivers noticed the flashing lights and the scene on the roadside. Some looked out their windows, curious, while others kept moving, not wanting to get involved. The officer seemed emboldened by the attention, raising his voice louder than necessary, telling the man to stand by the hood of his car. The man obeyed without resistance. He walked slowly to the front of the sedan, placed his hands lightly on the hood, and waited. His face remained calm, though in his heart he wondered why dignity so often had to be tested in moments like these. He had spent his life teaching that the law was for fairness, that respect for rules should bring peace, not humiliation, and yet here he was, being treated as though he were guilty without reason. The night grew heavier as the backup siren echoed in the distance. The elderly man closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He knew this was only the beginning of the ordeal, but he also knew something the officer did not. Time, patience, and truth would soon reveal everything. The officer's voice grew sharper as the quiet night air carried his commands. The elderly man stood calmly near the hood of his car, his hands loosely placed in front of him. He had given his documents, followed every instruction, and yet the officer seemed determined to find a reason to escalate the situation. Instead of recognizing respect and cooperation, the officer mistook calmness for defiance. The flashing red and blue lights drew more attention now. Cars that passed slowed down and a few drivers pulled to the side, curious about what was happening. Some lowered their windows and others picked up their phones, ready to record. In the modern world, people had learned that cameras could often tell the truth when words failed. The officer moved closer, circling the man as though he were circling a suspect. "Why are you so calm?" he asked in a mocking tone. "Most people would be nervous right now. Are you hiding something?" His flashlight beam danced across the man's suit and shoes, as if trying to catch a clue that did not exist. The elderly man answered softly, his tone even. "Officer, I have nothing to hide. I have given you my documents and I am standing here as you asked." His words were steady, his face free of anger. Years of discipline had taught him to keep control even in unfair situations, but the officer was not listening. He was speaking more to himself than to the man, as though convincing himself of wrongdoing. Late at night, driving a car like this, no nervousness, no excuses. Something doesn't add up. He shook his head and placed a hand on his belt, his stance stiffening with authority. The man glanced at the growing crowd nearby. A young woman had her phone raised, recording steadily. A group of college students whispered among themselves as they watched from the sidewalk. Another man leaned against his car, shaking his head slowly in disbelief. They all knew what they were witnessing, and their presence created a quiet tension that hung heavy in the night air. The officer noticed the onlookers but pressed on. "Backup will be here in a moment," he said almost proudly. "We'll get this sorted out. Until then, don't move." He pulled out his radio again, giving clipped updates, making it sound as though he had caught someone dangerous. The elderly man's expression did not change. His patience was not weakness. It was a shield. Inside, he thought about the countless times he had spoken to young lawyers about dignity in the face of insult, about holding steady when others tried to provoke. Now he was living the lesson he had taught so many times before. Minutes passed slowly until another police cruiser pulled up. Then another. The night grew brighter with flashing lights as more officers stepped out. 3 uniformed men walked quickly toward the scene, their hands near their belts, their faces serious. They trusted the radio call and approached with suspicion already in their eyes. The first officer wasted no time. "This man was driving suspiciously. He claims the car is his, but I don't buy it," he said with confidence. His words painted a story that had no truth, but his fellow officers listened closely. One of them turned to the elderly man. "Sir, is this your vehicle?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in the documents. "Yes," the man replied politely. "You have the registration papers. Everything is in order." His voice was calm, but the way he stood, tall, steady, and unshaken, carried a quiet power that some of the crowd noticed immediately. Still, the first officer pushed harder. "He refuses to explain himself. Keeps acting like he's above the law. I think we need to search the car." The man's eyes lifted slightly. "Officer, I have explained myself. I told you where I am coming from and where I am going. I have cooperated fully, but you are wrong to suggest I am above the law. In fact, I have dedicated my life to serving it." His words were gentle, but they carried weight. The young officer did not like being challenged even with truth. His pride stung and he raised his voice louder. Then prove it. Stop talking in circles. You think your calm voice will change the facts? Not tonight. The tension thickened. The crowd grew larger and now murmurs filled the background. A man whispered to his friend, "Why are they treating him like this? He hasn't done anything." A woman added, "They already have his documents. What more do they want?" The voices of the people were small, but together they created a chorus of doubt. The officer ignored them, stepping closer. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered suddenly. His words cut the air like a blade. Some in the crowd gasped, and phones quickly adjusted their focus to capture the moment. The elderly man did not resist. He turned his head slightly, his eyes steady on the officer. "Are you sure this is the step you wish to take?" he asked calmly. His question was not fear but warning, soft, measured, and filled with quiet authority. The officer scoffed. "Don't try to intimidate me with big words. Hands behind your back. Now." He reached for the man's wrist, his hand firm. The scene felt frozen. The night had gone from quiet peace to a stage of rising conflict. The flashing lights reflected on faces filled with concern, and every eye watched closely. The elderly man stood still, his mind clear, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. Another cruiser pulled up, and from it stepped a sergeant. His walk was brisk, his eyes sharp. He had answered the backup call and expected to see a dangerous situation. Instead, what he saw made him pause in his tracks. The elderly man standing by the hood of the car was no ordinary driver. Recognition flashed in his eyes and his heart skipped. He knew this man, knew his face, his name, his role. The sergeant's steps slowed. He raised a hand toward the officer as if to stop him, but the young man was too caught up in his own authority. The officer was seconds away from forcing the man's hands into cuffs when the sergeant finally spoke, his voice firm and filled with urgency. "Wait, stop right there." The crowd fell silent at once. The officer turned, annoyed. "What is it, Sergeant?" "I'm handling this." The sergeant's eyes stayed on the elderly man, his voice respectful now. "Do you know who this is?" The officer frowned. "Yeah, some old man who thinks he's smarter than the law." The sergeant shook his head slowly, disbelief in his tone. "You have no idea who you're talking to." The elderly man stood still, saying nothing, his calm presence stronger than ever. He had waited for this moment, not out of pride, but out of patience. The truth was about to surface, and nothing could stop it now. The crowd leaned forward, their phones steady, their eyes wide. The young officer's pride clashed with confusion as the sergeant's words hung in the air. A revelation was near, and the balance of the night was about to shift completely. The night air grew heavier as silence fell over the street. The flashing lights painted the scene in red and blue, washing across the faces of the crowd, the cars, and the elderly man standing tall beside his sedan. The sergeant's voice still echoed in everyone's ears. "Do you know who this is?" It was a question that had stopped everything in its tracks. The young officer, his hand still hovering near the elderly man's arm, froze. He looked at the sergeant with confusion, irritation flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked. "He's just another driver acting suspicious. What are you trying to say?" His tone carried both pride and doubt, like a man who believed he was right but feared he might be wrong. The sergeant stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the elderly man. He had seen that face before, on television, in newspapers, in portraits displayed in law schools and federal buildings. There was no mistake. He knew exactly who this man was. The sergeant straightened his posture and spoke carefully, his voice carrying respect. "This is Justice Name, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court." The words fell like thunder, stunning both the officers and the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. The young officer's mouth opened slightly as though he had heard something unbelievable. He blinked at the man standing so calmly in front of him, then looked back at the sergeant. "What did you say?" His voice was almost a whisper now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. The sergeant repeated himself, even firmer this time. "This man is a Supreme Court justice. He is one of the highest judges in this nation. Do you understand what you've done?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The woman holding her phone recording whispered loudly, "Oh my God." Another man in the back said, "He's a judge? A Supreme Court judge?" The murmurs grew until the whole group of bystanders was buzzing with shock and disbelief. The entire tone of the scene had shifted in a heartbeat. The elderly man finally spoke, his voice calm, his words steady and clear. "I told you I had done nothing wrong. I gave you my documents. I asked for respect. But you chose not to listen." He looked directly at the young officer, his eyes neither angry nor vengeful but filled with the weight of truth. The officer stepped back, his pride shattering. His face turned pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had treated one of the most respected men in the country as though he were a criminal, and the entire encounter had been witnessed by a crowd and recorded on dozens of phones. His confidence drained away, replaced by fear and regret. The sergeant cleared his throat and stepped between the officer and the justice. "Sir," he said respectfully, addressing the justice, "on behalf of this department, I apologize deeply. This should never have happened." His voice carried both shame and urgency. The justice nodded slightly. "Apologies are words. What matters is whether lessons are learned," he replied, his tone still calm. His voice was not raised, but every person there could hear the wisdom in it. The young officer tried to speak, his voice stumbling. I didn't know who you were," he muttered, almost pleading. "If I had known—" The justice's eyes sharpened slightly, though his tone remained soft. "You should not treat people with respect only if you know who they are. Every person deserves dignity. Every person deserves fairness, no matter their title or station." His words pierced through the night, and the officer felt them like a weight on his chest. The crowd applauded softly, some nodding their heads. A college student whispered, "That's powerful." Another said, "He's right. That's the truth." The justice's calm voice had reached everyone who was listening, and the moment grew larger than just one roadside stop. The sergeant turned sharply to the young officer. "Take your hands off him." "Step back now," he commanded. The officer obeyed quickly, lowering his hand and stepping away, his arrogance completely gone. He looked down at the ground, avoiding the eyes of the crowd, wishing he could erase what had just unfolded. More silence followed. The justice adjusted his glasses and looked around at the people watching. He was not embarrassed, nor did he feel the need to shout. Instead, his dignity shone brighter than the flashing police lights. He had been humiliated, but he had not been broken. The sergeant tried again, his voice quiet but full of respect. "Justice Name, would you like us to escort you home? We will make sure you are safe from here." The justice shook his head gently. "I can take myself home. What I need from you is not an escort. What I need is change. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. That is the real danger." His words struck deep, not just to the officers, but to the people standing around. Everyone knew they were hearing something important, something that would stay in their minds long after this night ended. The young officer swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to apologize, but his pride kept him frozen. He knew the damage was done, and no apology could erase the videos already spreading across phones and soon across the internet. His career, his reputation, his future, they all felt uncertain now. The justice took a slow breath and looked directly at him. "Remember this moment, officer. Power is not in the badge, nor in the weapon, nor in the authority you believe you have. True power is in justice, fairness, and respect. Without those, authority means nothing." The officer lowered his head, ashamed, his arrogance fully broken. The sergeant placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back toward the other officers, silently telling him to step away from the scene. The justice turned back toward his car. The crowd parted quietly, giving him space, though many of them kept recording. As he opened the door to his sedan, he paused, looked once more at the gathering of people, and spoke clearly. "Let this not just be a story of humiliation. Let this be a reminder of the work still left to do." Then he sat inside his car, his movements calm and steady. The crowd began to murmur again, their voices filled with amazement and respect. Some clapped softly, others nodded, and a few whispered about how this video would change everything. They had all just witnessed a moment where truth rose above pride, where dignity defeated arrogance, and where wisdom silenced ignorance. The sergeant stood in silence, watching the justice drive away, his heart heavy with both relief and regret. He knew this night would be remembered for years, not just in their department but across the nation. And the young officer stood apart, his thoughts swirling, his pride shattered. He had pulled over a man he thought was powerless, Instead, he had faced a man who represented the very heart of justice. The night ended not with anger or violence, but with revelation. The truth was out, the world had seen, and nothing could take that back. News traveled faster than anyone expected. By the time the justice reached his home that night, the video of the roadside stop was already spreading across social media. Clips from the bystanders' recordings showed the flashing lights, the officer's harsh tone, the calm dignity of the elderly man, and finally, the shocking moment of revelation when the sergeant identified him as a Supreme Court justice. Within hours, the video was everywhere, on phones, on television, and across news websites. Headlines screamed with outrage. Supreme Court justice stopped and humiliated during traffic stop. Racial bias at its worst, justice targeted. Caught on camera, officer pulls over nation's top judge. The story grew larger with each passing hour, pulling in voices from every corner of society. In homes across the country, people shook their heads in disbelief. Some could not believe that such disrespect could be shown to one of the highest judges in the land. Others were not surprised at all, seeing it as yet another sign of deep problems that had existed for years. In cafes and offices and on street corners, people talked about the video, replaying it over and over. The police department woke up to chaos. Their phones rang non-stop with calls from reporters, lawyers, and concerned citizens. The chief of police held an emergency meeting before sunrise, demanding answers. "How did this happen?" he asked, his voice stern. No one had a good answer. They all looked at one another. But the truth was clear. The arrogance of one officer had dragged the entire department into a storm. By morning, the young officer who had pulled the justice over was placed on suspension. His badge and weapon were taken, and he was told to stay home until the investigation was complete. He sat in silence in his small apartment, watching the news play his face over and over, his pride from the night before now replaced by shame and fear. The world was watching, and there was no way to hide. Meanwhile, the justice went about his morning calmly, as though nothing unusual had happened. He made his tea, read through case notes, and prepared for his day. But outside his home, reporters gathered, waiting for a statement. Cameras flashed whenever he stepped out, their voices rising with questions. "Justice, how do you feel about what happened last night? Do you plan to press charges? Do you believe this was racial profiling?" The justice answered little at first, preferring silence to hurried words. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority that had silenced the young officer the night before. "Last night was not about who I am," he said. "It was about what so many face every day. I was treated with suspicion, not because of my actions, but because of assumptions. If this can happen to me, imagine what happens to those who do not have a title or a position. The real question is not about my dignity. It is about the dignity of every person in this country." Those words spread across every news channel. They were replayed again and again, printed in bold letters across newspapers. People quoted him on social media, adding their own voices of support. For many, his calm response became a call to look deeper into the system that allowed such encounters to continue. Inside the police department, tension grew heavier. Officers whispered about the incident, some angry at the young officer for embarrassing them, others quietly admitting that it was not the first time such treatment had been handed out to someone innocent. Training sessions were rushed into place, supervisors ordered new reviews, and the chief released a public statement promising serious changes. But not everyone was convinced. Protesters gathered outside the department, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Respect everyone." They chanted through the day and into the night, their voices echoing in the streets. For them, this was not just one mistake. It was proof of a deeper wound in society. The young officer, trapped in his apartment, watched the protests on television. He saw his name trending on social media, his face in every headline. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again, his arrogance, his tone, the way he ignored the justice's calm words. Shame burned in his chest, but it was too late to undo what he had done. Back at the courthouse, the justice continued his work. Cases still needed to be reviewed, arguments still needed to be heard, and decisions still needed to be made. But as he sat in his chambers, his mind drifted back to the roadside, to the flashing lights and the officer's harsh commands. He had faced disrespect, yet he had not raised his voice. He had endured humiliation, yet he had not let anger take control. Instead, he had stood firm, reminding everyone that dignity could not be taken away unless it was surrendered. One afternoon, he agreed to give a public statement in front of the courthouse steps. Reporters filled the square, cameras lined up, and citizens gathered to hear his words. He walked out slowly, his presence commanding silence without force. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I will not focus on one officer. This is not about a single person, but about a culture that must change. Law enforcement has power, and with power comes responsibility. Every citizen, no matter who they are, deserves respect. I was treated unfairly, but I was also fortunate. Fortunate because people were watching, because cameras recorded, because I had a name that could not be ignored. Many others are not so fortunate. Their voices are silenced, their dignity dismissed. We must change this, not for me, but for them." Applause erupted, not wild, but steady and respectful. His words struck the hearts of those listening, not with anger, but with truth. That evening, news anchors described his speech as measured, wise, and powerful. Legal scholars wrote articles praising his restraint, while community leaders called it a turning point. Even critics who often disagreed with the court admitted that his words carried undeniable weight. The story had become larger than the stop itself. It was no longer just about one night on a quiet road. It had become a symbol, a reminder, and a challenge to society. Could a nation built on law and justice truly claim fairness if even its highest judge was not immune to suspicion? Could dignity be promised if it was not practiced at every level? The officer's mistake had opened a wound, but the justice's response had turned that wound into a lesson. And while protests continued and debates raged, one truth had become clear to everyone. Dignity, respect, and fairness were not luxuries. They were rights. And the justice, with his calm strength, had reminded the nation of that truth in a way no one would ever forget. The days following the incident were filled with noise. News outlets replayed the video endlessly, commentators argued on television, and protests carried on in front of police stations across the country. But for the justice, life returned to a quiet rhythm. He still woke early, read through case briefs, and prepared for hearings. Outwardly, he seemed unchanged, but inside, he carried the weight of what had happened. He knew the incident was not about him alone. It was a reflection of something larger, something rooted deep in society. He received letters from across the country. Some came from lawyers and professors, thanking him for his restraint and wisdom. Others came from ordinary citizens, sharing their own painful experiences of being stopped, questioned, or treated unfairly. Many wrote that his calmness gave them courage, that his dignity gave them hope. The justice read each letter carefully, often pausing to reflect before placing it neatly in a box he kept in his study. Meanwhile, the young officer at the center of it all lived in silence. His name had become known for the wrong reasons. Where he once walked proudly in uniform, he now stayed inside, avoiding public places. The suspension hung over him like a heavy chain. Each day he replayed the moment in his mind. The flashing lights, the crowd, the words of the sergeant, and above all, the calm voice of the justice. Those words echoed inside him. True power is in justice, fairness, and respect. At first, he resisted them, clinging to pride. But slowly, as the days stretched into weeks, he began to understand their meaning. The police department faced its own reckoning. Training programs were reshaped, seminars on bias and respect were held, and supervisors were ordered to emphasize accountability. Some officers welcomed the change, admitting it was long overdue. Others resisted quietly, grumbling that one mistake had created too much attention. But regardless of opinion, the department knew the nation was watching and nothing could remain the same. 1 month later, the justice delivered a speech at a national conference on law and society. The auditorium was filled with judges, lawyers, students, and reporters. Cameras were fixed on him as he stepped to the podium. He wore his usual dark suit, his glasses resting neatly on his face, his demeanor calm and steady. He began simply. "A few weeks ago, I was stopped on the side of the road. What happened that night is not unique. It happens every day to men and women across this nation. The only difference is that I carry a title that forced the world to pay attention. But the lesson is not about me. It is about everyone who cannot raise their voice, whose stories go unseen, whose dignity is dismissed." The hall was silent as he spoke. His voice was gentle, but his words were powerful. We must remember that the law is not just words written on paper. It is not just decisions in a courtroom. The law lives in how we treat one another every day. It lives in respect and fairness, in the belief that no person is less deserving of dignity than another. When we forget this, the law loses its meaning. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. Then he continued, I do not ask for anger. I do not ask for revenge. I ask for reflection. I ask for change. Let us build a society where justice is not something one must fight for on the roadside, but something that is given freely in every encounter, no matter how small. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Some had tears in their eyes, others nodded deeply, and many knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for years. The justice had taken an experience of humiliation and turned it into a lesson of wisdom, not just for the legal system, but for the nation as a whole. Back in his chambers later that day, the justice sat quietly by the window, looking out at the city skyline. He thought about the officer. Despite the disrespect, he felt no hatred toward him. Instead, he hoped that the young man had learned something from the encounter. Perhaps humility, perhaps patience, perhaps the truth that authority without respect is empty. The young officer, sitting alone in his apartment, watched the justice's speech on television. His chest tightened as he listened. Each word felt like it was directed at him. He thought about the pride that had blinded him, the arrogance that had led him to ignore simple decency. For the first time in weeks, he whispered aloud, I was wrong. It was only 3 words, but they carried the weight of change over time. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by new events, new controversies, and new debates. But the impact did not disappear. Law schools used the video and the justice's speeches as teaching material. Police academies added new lessons on respect and dignity. Community leaders quoted the justice's words in town halls, reminding people of the importance of fairness. And in quiet corners of the country, ordinary people remembered. They remembered the night an officer tried to humiliate an elderly man, only to discover that he was a Supreme Court justice. They remembered the calm strength with which he faced injustice. And they remembered the lesson he left behind, that dignity is not a privilege but a right. One evening, months later, the justice walked through the halls of the courthouse. His steps were steady, his expression thoughtful. A young clerk approached him nervously, holding a stack of papers. Justice, may I say something? She asked. He nodded kindly. I watched the video that night, she said. It changed how I see the world. It changed why I want to be a lawyer. I want to fight for fairness, not just in courtrooms, but everywhere. The justice smiled softly, his eyes reflecting both pride and humility. Then you have already understood what many take years to learn. The law is not just for the powerful. It is for the people, all of them. As he walked on, the clerk stood taller, inspired by his words. And the justice knew that while one night on a roadside had been painful, it had also planted seeds of change in hearts and minds across the country. The world would forget the flashing lights and the noise of outrage, but it would not forget the calm voice of an elderly man who stood for dignity, respect, and justice. That was his true legacy.